Well, let's begin. And then if we get any latecomers, they'll catch up just fine. Welcome, everyone. I hope we've all been enjoying a virtual conference insofar as we can. I'm happy to chair this panel. This is panel number 22 for those keeping score in the audience. This is Race, Gender, and National Belonging in New Europe. My name is Tait Keller. I'm going to be chairing the panel and then offering the briefest of comments afterwards. And I'll introduce each of our panelists in turn. First, we'll have Peter Thompson, who will present to us Deadly Winds from the East, Racialized Interpretations of Poison Gas in Germany, 1915 to 1945. Then we'll have Meghann Pytka presenting to us Administrative Violence, an intersectional analysis of the Polish Constitution of 1921. And then lastly, we'll have Cristina Stoica, who will present for us Romanianization and the creation of zones of allocation, Romanian policies targeting Roma during the interwar period. First, we'll hear from Peter Thompson. He's a historian of science, technology, and the environment. His work focuses on chemical protection policies in 20th century Germany. He is currently the Haas postdoctoral fellow at the Science History Institute in Philadelphia, where he is working on his book project entitled Grasping for the Mask, German Visions of Chemical Modernity, 1915 to 1938. He earned his PhD in history from the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. Peter, take it away.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen here. Could someone tell me if they can see this okay?
Yes, looks like we can see it.
Great, thank you. First of all, thank you to the SHA organizers. I don't know if any of them are here, but I'm sure that, moving this through the various iterations over the couple of years has been a good bit of work. So I want to thank you for that. I'd also like to thank Dr. Keller for agreeing to chair this and do some comments on it. And lastly, I want to thank the audience for being willing to engage with my work here today. I also want to make a quick note before I start, and that is that this presentation will be saturated with both physical and rhetorical violence, which it sounds like from some of the titles on this panel, maybe that will transcend all three of them, I don't know. But it's just something I wanted to note ahead of time, and that there also will be racialized terms in translation from German to English. And those don't exactly have the same historical context as the translated English term, but still something I wish to note. And lastly, as you can see here, my title is slightly different. It really won't change what I'm presenting, but for just various narrative reasons, I've changed the title to The White Cloud, Racialized Interpretations of Poison Gas in Germany, 1915 to 1945. So on April 22nd, 1915, outside of the small Belgian town of Ypres, specialized German military engineers would carry out a plan of attack that contemporaries and historians alike have claimed to redefine modern warfare. In a coordinated effort under the direction of the chemist Fritz Haber, you can see him on the left pointing at the poison gas, these men released chlorine gas towards entrenched French colonial soldiers in what is often said to be the birth of chemical warfare, which was about less than a year after the start of World War I. Now, military reports from the subsequently titled Second Battle of Ypres claimed that the French lines dissolved in panic as men ran choking from the eerie yellowish-green gas that crept towards them. 2 days later, German gas was again used against nearby Canadian troops who supposedly stood their ground bravely among the deadly swirling clouds, as we can see here in this commemorative depiction of the event. And in the end, the Allies claimed that the combined attacks killed 15,000 men and injured another 5,000, while London newspapers published evocative illustrations of French soldiers falling to the ground, grasping at their throats, alongside numerous op-eds decrying the perfidious German use of chemical weapons, which can somewhat be seen here in this political cartoon in which Kaiser Wilhelm is some kind of devilish alchemist of some sort. Now, this is the standard story of the Second Battle of Ypres, and one that, on the whole, has been passed down fairly intact from Allied news and propaganda outlets to many, although not all, military historians and historians of international law. But perhaps not surprisingly, given the story's provenance, it allied some of the more complicated and interesting details of the battle. Most notably, as historian Ulrich Trumpener has noted, this story wildly overestimates the Allied casualties while ignoring the fact that the French had been using tear gas grenades against the Germans since the start of the war. And these are just two quick examples of the kinds of interesting and sticky questions that have been left out of the standard story of Ypres by sweeping aside the German telling of the event. But they bring me to what I find to be equally thought-provoking and an understudied aspect of this story, which gestures towards the major subject of my talk here today. In thinking through the narrative tropes that animate the Ypres tale, I came to ask myself, why did the Franco-Algerian troops supposedly flee in confusion while the Canadians were able to stand fast in the face of a 150-ton white cloud of chlorine? Or at least, why was this aspect of the story so often repeated as if it was particularly important? And I certainly wondered whether this was truly the case or whether this version of the story reflected certain historical assumptions about nationality, ethnicity, race, and the development of chemical warfare. Now, ultimately, I'm not sure that I'll be able to necessarily answer this very complicated reception question in its totality here. But what I hope to do is reveal the ways in which one particular notion of German racial distinction was increasingly tied to technological skills behind chemical warfare over the course of World War I and through the interwar period. And in doing so, I intend to trace the conceptual development of these racialized ideas, first revealing the ways in which the Algerian retreat at Ypres fit within certain German preconceptions and historical rereadings of chemical warfare, and then briefly sketching the ways in which these interpretations maintained an afterlife that persisted through the most infamous use of chemical technologies for murder, that is, the gassing programs of the Holocaust. Now, I know that such a diachronic project has some potentially large implications in the fields of modern German history, the history of modern science and technology, and perhaps most of all, Holocaust studies. But I hope that you're willing to suspend any immediate skepticism so that I can first turn back to 1915 and work my way forward chronologically. And even if you remain skeptical of my conceptual history at the end of my talk, I still hope that it can serve as a provocation to think through the kind of imbalances of power, perception, and even legal rights that have been regularly inscribed into chemical weapons across the 20th century and up to today. So now let me return to the Second Battle of Ypres and begin retelling it from the German perspective. I'd like to first start by pointing out that the Germans did not take the decision to deploy chlorine gas lightly at all. Indeed, they were fully aware of the fact that they would likely be censured by the Allies, and in fact, almost all of the German generals in 1915 refused to allow gas to be first used on their respective fronts. The established story goes that only Albrecht of Württemberg, commander of the Fourth Army on the Ypres front, begrudgingly assented to the plan, largely due to the increasingly apparent fact that the Schlieffen plan had stalled, and that the Germans could not break through the French lines with conventional tactics. I'm going to admit to you now that I don't have a smoking gun for the following provocation, but one can't help but wonder if there's a further consideration here. The northern part of the Ypres salient, where the Germans had first deployed their gas, was manned by the 45th and 87th divisions of French colonial troops, made up primarily of Moroccan and Algerian men. Regardless of whether or not the colonial or even racial status of their enemies truly played into the German decision-making process, the foreignness of the French colonial troops certainly became important for at least some of the German infantrymen who followed the chlorine cloud during the attack. German depictions of the battle, much like their British counterparts, featured dark-skinned men in their bright red and blue French uniforms, falling to their knees and grasping at their throats, as we can see here in both these depictions. And I'm particularly interested in the one on the left, which comes from essentially the standard telling of World War I German chemical weapons campaign from the 1920s in Germany by a guy named Rudolf Hanslien, who will pop up again later. According to German witnesses, those who escaped the gas ran from their positions in panic, leaving behind their guns and the fezzes that distinctly marked them as colonial troops. One infantryman, a private Pytka, wrote of the attack, quote, "Woe be unto the enemy when they encounter our perfume. It's pure mass murder, and with almost devilish joy, we put an end to them quickly. We didn't take many prisoners. We beat to death everyone left alive in the trenches." While certain other reports do suggest that the Germans killed many of the gassed Algerians and Moroccans who writhed on the ground in agony, a German ambulance driver described the few Algerian men who were taken captive after the attack, referring to them as the quote-unquote bad-smelling Negroes who cried like helpless babies outside of the field hospital. In light of the standard telling of Ypres, I think it's important to make it explicitly clear that the first German gas attack on April 22nd was expressly intended to break the Algerian lines, thus allowing German troops to sweep behind the Canadians to the south. And while some Canadian troops were hit by the chlorine clouds before they dispersed, their level of exposure was unlikely to equal that of their Algerian and Moroccan allies. More German gas attacks would come in the following days, but by then the Canadians had been outfitted with cotton mouth pads. And admittedly, this was not any kind of an ideal solution, but it was perhaps more important that poison gas's element of surprise had been drastically reduced. Nevertheless, the Germans and the British press largely accepted the idea that the Canadians had stood their ground in the face of gas, while the undisciplined and impulsive Algerians had fled in chaos. Such a simplified account of the multiple attacks suggested to many early German commentators that Europeanness, increasingly defined by overdetermined physical features like skin color or nebulously conceived mental traits like technological skill, proved the difference in chemical warfare aptitude. And I also want to note here that many of these German stereotypes about North African and especially later on sub-Saharan troops, supposedly undisciplined and impulsive nature, were brought quickly to hand largely because they had been constructed and widely disseminated throughout Germany's 19th century imperial endeavors. Now, due to the proclaimed success of their gas attacks against the Algerians, German military chemists very quickly began to posit poison gas as a distinctly German or European weapon, born of the industrial advancements of European civilization. Indeed, a historical moment in which many Europeans first came face to face on their own soil with colonial populations and the extreme levels of violence that had formerly been exclusively associated with colonial lands, continued assertions of European superiority through technological aptitude proliferated. Furthermore, according to many German military chemists like Fritz Haber, the man who directed the first attack and the chemical war program across the war, poison gas was in fact more humane than bullets and artillery shells. It was a civilized weapon that would increasingly reduce the level of violence in warfare as it was progressively developed. You can see that here in these quotes from Haber in the interwar period, as well as military reports from the war. Now, regardless of these initial claims of German or even more broadly European chemical superiority, German soldiers and commanders still largely remained unsure if they truly maintained control over their newfound chemical technology. In their attacks at Ypres, for instance, the gas led to about 2,000 self-inflicted German casualties, men who had inhaled chlorine either while preparing the gas cylinders or by venturing too close to the gas cloud during the attack. Furthermore, once the gas was released, unexpected changes in wind direction could and did sometimes bring the gas back onto German troops, making the weapon a rather unreliable ally over the next 2+ years of fighting. In fact, the fear of poison gas was one of the major reasons that the Germans actually really failed to gain significant ground in the wake of the Ypres attack, because soldiers refused to closely follow the gas and looked for any excuse to stop their attack. Okay, so then let's move to the interwar with some of these ideas. I think it's fair to say that a growing field of historical literature has effectively revealed while 19th century empire was the laboratory in which many European ethno-racial categories were first conceived, World War I was certainly one arena in which these categories were vigorously tested, applied, and refashioned based on the changing circumstances of European identities in a seemingly more connected world. And indeed, weaponized poison gas, an apparent hallmark of the evolving nature of modern warfare, developed concurrently and interrelatedly with German conceptions of race, ethnicity, and national belonging. World War I apparently proved to many Germans that all future wars would be waged along ethno-national lines that can now be easily described in racialized terms. So just for one instance, in 1919, the German linguist Wilhelm Dögen wrote that, quote, Germany did not fight against a world of armies, but rather against a world of races, end quote. It was precisely the global nature of the war that justified the vague idea that each belligerent nation had both a unique political and biological identity, and that these racial differences determined the aptitudes of each people during wartime. In the vein of this developing post-war racial logic, the Germans remained quite unsure whether they were, again, the ultimate masters of chemical weapons. Since the end of World War I, Europeans across the continent assumed that any future national struggle would feature the use of air power and poison gas. Pointing out that airplanes could now cut to the center of any nation and drop gas bombs on unsuspecting civilians, military theorists like the highly influential Italian Giulio Douhet, whose book you can see here on the left, argued that the nation with the strongest air force and the most devastating chemical weapons would dominate the future world order. And sometimes scholars have raised to me the question of, was gas truly that prevalent during this period, or was it more so just aerial attack in general? And I would say to them, it is fairly important, and one can see it purely in the number of, there's only one way to look at it. You can read diaries and so on, but just the number of novels that are published about gas wars. And I just have one example here, but there's really a proliferation of them in the 20s and 30s in Germany. Perhaps not surprisingly, this newly imagined chemical struggle tapped into pre-existing ethno-racial distinctions. For German nationalists who had imbibed social Darwinian thought, the future aerochemical war would be a struggle for life and a struggle for living space that would determine the ethno-racial groups that were fit for survival in a chemically precarious world. This set of ideas was fortified by various strands of young conservative nationalist thought that proliferated throughout the Weimar era. For example, attempting to blend firsthand experience with theoretical reflections on World War I, the philosopher Oswald Spengler foretold a coming race war in which the Germans might well prove victorious. Many know Spengler's name today for his widely read book, The Decline of the West, published in 1918 and then the second volume in 22, which posited the coming of a world historical struggle between racially and culturally essentialized civilizations. However, in his lesser-known subsequent work, Man and Technics from 1931, Spengler broached the role of technological thinking as a cultural force in this envisioned struggle. He wrote, quote, "For these colored peoples, the Faustian technics are in no way an inward necessity. It is only Faustian man that thinks, feels, and lives in this form. To him, it is a spiritual need, not on account of its economic consequences, but on account of its victories," end quote. It's worth noting that Spengler predominantly referred to Faustian man as a broadly Northern European ideal type, who, like Goethe's Faust, could harness the power of technology to an extent greater than individuals from any of Spengler's other broadly defined civilizations. Nevertheless, some German nationalists imported this idea as constituent of a more narrowly defined German or Germanic ethno-racial identity. In attempts to redress the German failures in World War I and the ignominies of the interwar experience, these men blended earlier constructions of race, nation, and ethnicity in order to proclaim the Faustian employment of technology as a quasi-spiritual German quality that would allow the German people to reshape the post-war world order. Not surprisingly, for many German military chemists and gas scientists, the harnessing of poison gas was the epitome of such Faustian techniques. In fact, in his 1932 History of Poison Gas, the gas scientist Ulrich Müller-Kiel wrote, quote, "It is probably not too much to say that the prohibition of chemical weapons, which the victorious states have declared for the German people, represents a short-sightedness. It is possible to imagine that in the not too distant future, the self-destruction of the white race comes to completion under the pressure of the increasingly empowered colored peoples. In such a decisive struggle, success will only result from the possession of the highest technical means, and among these is the use of chemical weapons," end quote. Now, in this little selection, Muller-Kiel expresses the importance of militarized technical knowledge by alluding to the possibility of what is basically a white genocide. Indeed, interwar anxieties swirled over the possibility that advanced European weaponry could be used against its creators. Similarly, the remarkably persistent idea that black skin was more resistant to poison gas deeply troubled German nationalists like Muller-Kiel, who tread in explicitly racialized visions of future war. Nevertheless, many of the most influential chemical weapons experts continued to insist that gas, if not inherently German, was at least European or a white weapon. For instance, in his well-received 1927 account of First World War chemical warfare, the former German gas officer Rudolf Hanslien wrote, quote, "Gas tightened the circle of peoples who could survive in a modern war. It has been shown that indigenous peoples, such as the colored troops, succumb more readily to the psychological pressures of gas warfare than the culturally higher Americans, Germans, English, and French." End quote. So now a very short conclusion about this. The conjoined idea is that chemical weapons mastery was tied to a crude conception of racial grouping, and that it could be the deciding factor in a future racialized struggle, certainly gained currency on the German right throughout the 1920s and 30s. The Nazis, among others, latched onto such ideas and then subsequently reinvested in German chemical weapons programs throughout the 1930s. Poison gas, which had in fact troubled German soldiers and civilians for more than 2 decades, was now imbued with a new symbolic meaning, or at least this particularly triumphant symbolic meaning was now insisted upon. In this particular Nazi vision, gas as an inherently German weapon could not possibly be strictly immoral or malevolent. Rather, returning to the rhetoric of World War I military chemists like Fritz Haber, many Nazi military and technical experts again argued that gas was more civilized and more controllable than other means of warfare. And it was precisely this kind of technologically utilitarian logic that animated the SS to devise mobile gassing vans and gas chambers. According to Heinrich Himmler, who had become sick while witnessing the mass execution of Jews in Roma in 1941, the use of poison gas would relieve German soldiers of the psychological burden of murder. Indeed, gas was again posited as a humane weapon that differentiated the Germans from other quote-unquote uncivilized peoples and prevented them from turning into so-called savages. For Himmler and many other Nazis, it was precisely this employment of techno-scientific thinking for industrialized mass murder that defined the Faustian German race. And it was this lopsided form of technological violence that punctuated the historical admixture of chemical weapons and racialized identity in Germany. By the early 1940s, the Nazis had clearly conceived of both the master and the victim of this newly imagined chemical world through ethno-racial categories that had developed concurrently and at times codependently with the mythos surrounding chemical weapons. Thus, while various German interpretations of the nature of chemical threat did indeed historically shift a good bit between World War I and the Holocaust, the obvious power imbalances and racialized presuppositions inscribed into chemical weapons from their first use at the Second Battle of Ypres serve as a dark conceptual thread that runs across the most cataclysmic events of modern German history, and has much to tell us about the subsequent employment of so-called weapons of mass destruction throughout the 20th century and up to today. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter, very much for that fascinating paper. Next up, we have Meghann Pytka, who's going to tell us about that Polish constitution. Meghann is a historian of East Central Europe. Her historical research focuses on the intersections of national and gender violence in modern Poland. In her daily life, she is an instructional specialist at the McKelvey School of Engineering at Washington University in St. Louis. This professional pivot is one of the many unintended, but in this case, happy consequences of that pandemic. Meghann, if you please.
Thank you very much, Tait. And now I'm going to be the jerk and say I pronounce my last name Pytka. Um,
I knew I'd get it wrong. Thank you.
I know. You were so careful with Cristina, and I would have pronounced her last name wrong. So there you go. You know, all comes full circle. But I want to thank everyone today, and I want to thank Tait for being particularly patient with me. Now that I do, in fact, operate in a world with chemical engineers on the regular basis, they have many needs, wants, and desires, and my craft of history is not always top of mind. But I am going to share my screen because I've put together a very preliminary slideshow, not as thoughtfully laid out as Peter's, and hopefully that is sharing. Are we seeing things potentially?
We are. Yep.
Awesome. This technology, sometimes our friend, often our foe. So yes, my piece is called Administrative Violence and an Intersectional Analysis of the Polish Constitution of 1921. And so let's just jump into it. After World War I, the signers of the Treaty of Versailles attempted to create a world in which Europe would never again be brought to total war. Now, it would fail, as we all know, but one of the moment's potentially nobler impulses was to protect minorities in the newly established states of Central and Eastern Europe. And the Polish Minority Treaty stands as an example. It legally bound Poland to protect its citizens, irrespective of race, nationality, or religion. And this protection was highly fraught, as Poland's demography was bewilderingly diverse, a fact that troubled the nationalist camp. They believed that establishing an ethno-linguistic nation state was the only strategy that would ensure Poland the strength to survive. Having secured a sizable plurality in the January 1919 elections, the nationalists were charged with establishing the legislative Sejm. Here, the Sejm is up on our slide, and you're getting a sense of the structure of what I'm now going to be providing you. And chief among these duties was drafting the new Polish Constitution, which was ratified on March 17th, 1921. Also known as the March Constitution, this document was riven by partisan politics as well as by the nationalists' contradictory desires to forge a chauvinist nation state whilst appeasing the international community. These warring impulses were expressed in the preeminent legal document of the Polish Second Republic. Though often regarded as supportive of minorities, both at the time and subsequently, the March Constitution was only superficially democratic. Intersectional analysis reveals that its supposed protections were at best decorative, if not actually discriminatory. Polish nationalists were able to appease the international community's desire for minority protections, whilst actually writing into law nativist bigotry by creating paternalist oversight of the very minorities it claimed to protect. An intersectional analysis of the March Constitution reveals a text riddled with ambiguity, which provided cover for marginalizing women, Jews, and the sexually subversive. In other words, by insisting on a unitary definition of Polishness that was male, Catholic, and conventionally sexual, the nationalist framers also united women, Jews, and the sexually subversive under the banner of enemies. Constitution making foists a society's legal, social, and symbolic ordering onto the less powerful. The disempowered can be categorized ad infinitum by religion, ethnicity, race, gender, sexuality, or class differences, etc. Nevertheless, constitution making codifies and hence formalizes these differences. And the codification inherent in constitution making is of a piece with state disciplinary power and regulatory practices. Moreover, codification is among the most important tasks fulfilled by state bureaucracies. State power, coercive power, and even lethal power is vested in these bureaucracies. Consequently, the complexity of the symbolic orderings presented in constitutions can be deconstructed using intersectional analysis, and the stakes could not be higher. Though often nowadays deployed as a hip buzzword in leftist circles, intersectionality was originally coined by Kimberly Williams Crenshaw in 1989. And at its core, intersectionality is a way of understanding the domination experienced by African American women within a very particular context. Because of its origins, certain activists have in fact become uncomfortable with the ways in which the term has been hijacked by white feminism to center white women's experiences. Now, I want to acknowledge the very real frustrations that these activists have. And I also want to acknowledge that the experiences of modern African American women cannot be transported wholesale and plopped down intellectually into 20th century multicultural Poland. Nevertheless, I do believe that the lessons of the intersectional paradigm are useful. Working within the Polish interwar context, this talk deploys intersectional analysis to interrogate the matrix of violence that treated sex, race, and gender as its primary axes of social organization. And yes, my teams will continue to go off while we're talking here today. Now, moving into the historical context. Drafted and ratified after the Declaration of Polish Independence in 1918, the March Constitution was intended to craft a government for a nation that had been stateless since the partitions of Poland at the end of the 18th century. Consequently, the framers of the March Constitution self-consciously looked to define Polishness juridically. By the early 1920s, Polish parties were deeply partisan, with two major ideological camps emerging. On the left, we had the Polish Socialist Party led by Józef Piłsudski. He and his followers envisioned a Poland based on a civic notion of Polishness. Those born within the old borders of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth could be Polish so long as they desired it and pledged allegiance to Poland. Meanwhile, on the right, there was the national camp, led by Roman Dmowski, and he and his party were ethnocentric in their orientation. For them, Polishness was linked to blood, to land, to language, to spirit, to Catholicism, super messy and amorphous. Dmowski consigned all of those who failed or who refused to fit his vision into a netherworld of internal alien threats. In this way, Jews, communists, Freemasons, feminists, divorcees, all were cast as foreign and hence nationally suspicious. The Polish Second Republic was in keeping with its time as it struggled to come to terms with its anxieties over national strength and survival. Maybe they weren't as fixated on chemical warfare at this moment Or maybe they were. I haven't read the papers from Warsaw Polytechnic. When reading the Polish constitution for the intersections of race, gender, and sexuality, 5 themes emerge that speak to the national camp's desire to re-traditionalize social relations. There was religion and religious freedom, minority protections, just keep moving through here, gender and minority protections, public morality, domestic life, and women's rights and responsibilities. For the purposes of this talk and for time, we will just focus on minority protections and women's rights. The March Constitution's treatment of religious minorities was structurally tied to the way in which it dealt with ethnic minorities. And in the minds of the nationalist camp, the two were coeval. Demonstrating how these categories collapsed onto themselves, every constitutional article in the March Constitution that mentions national minorities also references religious ones. For instance, in addressing the matters of civil liberties in Article 95, national minorities were invoked. This conflation is reinforced by the Constitution's treatment of language policies. Article 109 explained that every citizen has the right of preserving his nationality and developing his mother tongue and national characteristics. Special state statutes will guarantee to minorities in the Polish state the full and free development of their national characteristics with assistance from autonomous minority unions endowed with the character of public law organizations within the limits of unions of general self-government. Beautiful language. And superficially, Article 109 assured the protection of these differences. Yet this article also undercut this very protection using the term nationalities rather than nations, thereby by positioning those seen as nationalities as less weighty, less historic, less valid. In Polish nation versus nationality, there's a hierarchy there. National development, the same Zionists noted, was not protected, nor was there a ban on discrimination, national, religious, ethnic, or linguistic. Indeed, the Jewish voting bloc did not believe that Article 109 had any teeth to actually protect minorities. In the weeks leading up to ratification, the legislative battles over this portion of the text were very bitter on the floor of the Sejm. Throughout most of early March, almost all of the Sejm's operations ground to a halt as the third draft of the Constitution was read aloud. As this final reading proceeded, deputies took to the floor to propose revisions and to voice their concerns over minority protections. Exchanges between the national camp and the Jewish bloc were particularly bitter. Catholic priest Father Kazimierz Lutosławski and members of the Jewish bloc practically came to blows over Article 109 and those adjacent to it. On March 8th, 1921, Lutosławski made a speech in which he goaded the Jewish deputies. After criticizing the Polish Minority Treaty as a shameful burden that the new constitution must bear, he decried the following: our fellow Jews for their insistence upon minority protections, scoffing, as if there could be a doubt to their existence in Poland. In the audience was Ignacy Schipper, who would later die at Majdanek. Nevertheless, it was Itzhak Grunbaum from that particular camp who received the lion's share of Lutosławski's ire. Grunbaum had long been a thorn in Lutosławski's side, and at almost every turn, Grunbaum looked to expose the anti-Semitic intentions embedded in the national camp's policies. For his efforts, Lutosławski decried Grunbaum's activities as bullying and an insult to the nation. Yet Lutosławski continued to press his case for further amendments to strengthen the nationalist position. He wanted to restore a constitutional guarantee, quote, that only a Pole and a Catholic could be the president of the Republic. He explained that in the president's capacity as head of state, he would have to be required to attend foreign services, particularly religious ones, and as head of a Catholic country, Lutosławski reasoned, the constitution of a Catholic country must protect the Catholic temple against the rape that the introduction of a foreign believer acting on behalf of it would entail. Continuing to merge the language of bodily violation with Judaism, Lutosławski soothed, "Gentlemen, you say that such laws violate citizenship. Would anyone dare that England, for example, was a country that would commit rape for the sake of civil equality? Could anyone for a moment think that England is a backward country in terms of civil rights?" As Lutosławski rationalized his position with England's supposed civility, which would have surprised his colonized co-religionists in Ireland, Grunbaum heckled from the seats, prompting the priests to snap, "Go build Palestine." Grunbaum eventually would, making Aliyah in 1948, but not before rebutting Lutosławski. The following day, Grunbaum took to the floor to refute Lutosławski and to strengthen the guarantees stipulated in Article 109. At this point, much of his hope for moderation had waned. 5 months earlier, he had made a speech on the floor of the Sejm exposing the homogenizing intents of the right wing. His words, rather than having been heeded, had been met with insult and derision. Defeated but undeterred, Grunbaum refused to be silenced. Speaking one last time to criticize the draft of the March Constitution, Grunbaum declared, "I have no illusion that I can convince anyone in this high Sejm that the amendments we, the Jewish bloc, are putting forward should be accepted for the good of the state. Our victory is only moral in nature." Resigned that his amendments would not pass, Grunbaum addressed Lutosławski's theory of religion, one wherein Poland had been denied its religion by Poland's Jews and by the Polish Minority Treaty. In the face of this logic, Grunbaum reasoned, Lutosławski had nothing to fear, as the constitutional draft actually works to establish Roman Catholicism as the prevailing religion. Grunbaum saw anti-Semitism as the driving impetus for this hierarchy, for as he closed, he declared that the ideology of Jan Jelensky, an arch anti-Semite of the 19th century, has now become the catechism of the National Party, the catechism of almost all parties, not only right-wing parties, but also our center parties. Thus, Grunbaum indicted the left, as well as the right, along with Lutosławski. The following day, a fellow member of the Jewish bloc, Samuel Hirschhorn, despaired as he criticized the constitutional draft. In general, the equality of the citizens has been extremely comical. It is clear, however, that he saw only tragedy in this comedy. As he exclaimed in defeat, "I never, when asking for rights, used to cite treaties, because I once felt that the Polish state would give its Jewish citizens the same rights as its other citizens." Plainly, Hirschhorn no longer saw any reason to trust the magnanimity of the Second Republic. Much as the national and religious minorities received special attention, so too did women. On the one hand, the March Constitution enshrined into law women's citizenship and suffrage under Articles 12 and 13. On the other, women were cause for concern. Women's labor, both in the birthing room and in the marketplace, required additional regulations. For instance, Article 103, very close to the article that the Jewish bloc was concerned about, positionally, positioned the state as the primary protector of motherhood. This was the same article that restricted women's employment options. Though no citizens were to have their labor and earning potential infringed upon, per Article 102, women were not allowed to participate in remunerative labor after dark, according to 103. The March Constitution's impulses to limit women's public actions after dark had a number of potential implications. Historically, women out of doors after dark were considered public women. This meant that they were available for sexual intrigue. They were also associated with prostitution, a domain linked in the minds of the Polish right with the Jews. Consequently, the constitutional prohibition on women's work after dark achieved three nationalist goals. It created a sense that Polish women were morally and physically vulnerable, especially since after dark in wintertime Poland can mean as early as 3 p.m. It also put women squarely within the home at the end of the workday so that they could engage in domestic duties. Finally, this clause created a wider distinction between virtuous Republican mothers and the ladies of the night. Not only did prostitution present the obvious dangers of moral corruption and venereal disease, it also posed the racial threat of miscegenation. By controlling women's bodies, the document distanced Polish women from supposed Jewish pimps. The constitutional limits and protections placed upon women were in keeping with the National Camp's writings. Indeed, the nationalists had long argued that women required extra attention. At the time, and certain audiences were quick to recognize the March Constitution as a wolf in sheep's clothing. Both feminist sexologists and politically engaged Jews were two such critical groups. One of the harshest critics of the right's constitutional agenda was a contributor to the feminist journal, The Women's Voice, a feminist and sometimes sexologist by the name of Justyna Budzinska-Tylicka. In her view, the March Constitution was far too indebted to the sexually repressive Napoleonic Civil Code, asking why Polish women had been rendered so weak by the new Constitution. She despaired, because of Napoleon. Noting the inconsistencies found in the March Constitution regarding women's equality, she declared, according to the principles of the Constitution, a woman may be a deputy without her husband's position. But for all of this, the Administrative Committee has now passed that for all practical purposes, when considering civil service, a married woman cannot hold a state job without her husband's permission. What bigos? It's like sloppy soup. What stale old bigos? Budzinska-Tylicka's rightly read the sexual implications of the March Constitution. Heterosexual Republican motherhood were the destinies laid out for Poland's women, destinies that were to be suspended in traditional patriarchy. Much as the Polish feminists and sexologists saw the framing of the March Constitution as a right-wing exercise in cynicism and in illiberalism, so too did the same Jewish deputies. On the day that the March Constitution was ratified, Jewish deputies refused to celebrate. And later, we would see that there would be those who called out the March Constitution for its various slights against the Polish Jewish community. A year after the ratification of the March Constitution, one deputy and lawyer, Apollinaire Hartglass, wrote an essay entitled The Yellow Patch, detailing his frustrations with the constitutional drafting process. In the Yellow Patch, he noted the gap that existed between official calls for equal rights and their implementation. Hartglass was extraordinarily intersectional in his criticism. Hartglass extended his observations to the quote-unquote women's question. He had come to see Polish law and its illiberal advocates as antithetical to, quote unquote, the principles of equality. And he maintained that though women's civil liberties were not his personal concern, ensuring women's equality was the first step towards real equality, he reasoned. Indeed, almost every time Hartglass took up the matter of women's rights on the floor of the Sejm, it was done with an eye towards dismantling the structures that limited Jewish rights. In so doing, he worked to expose the limitations placed on all Polish citizens who did not conform to the archetypes promoted and codified by the right. Writing in the shadow of the Polish Minorities Treaty, the drafters of the March Constitution sought the international approval of officials who hoped to avoid another total war in Europe by striking a balance between national self-determination and minority protections. And in general, the Anglophone world hailed the March Constitution as a success. Nevertheless, the ethno-religious and sexual implications of the March Constitution were not lost on one set of foreign eyes, and that was of the Irish arch-conservative Eamon de Valera. Upon assuming power in Dublin in 1932, he looked to replace the Constitution of the Irish Free State with a document more in keeping with Ireland's newly assumed sovereignty. And to this end, de Valera established a constitutional commission, and under the guidance of Father Edward Cahill and with the blessings of de Valera, a committee of Irish Jesuits established their own constitutional subcommittee. Meeting throughout 1936, the Jesuits looked to none other than the March Constitution as a template for Catholic legal theory to ensure the social and hygiene and moral standing of the Irish nation. De Valera's turn to the March Constitution demonstrates the utility of intersectional analysis when examining the Polish legal system. It exposes the right-wing ethnocentric dog whistles that de Valera heard and deployed. Intersectional analysis reveals the politics of domination and administrative violence that rested at the heart of the Polish state-building project during the interwar period. At the same time, it provides a more holistic approach to understanding the contradictions implicit in the March Constitution and in interwar Polish social life. By appreciating these matrices of domination, historians can better understand the legal and social forces that structured life in Poland between the two world wars. And with that, I will stop sharing my screen and I will cede the floor.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Meghann, for that incredibly insightful paper. Terrific. Next up is our final presentation of the day from Cristina Stoica. She's going to present to us about Romanianization in Romanian politics during the interwar period. Cristina, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Tait. I'm going to follow Peter and Meghann's presentations, but shift geographic focus a little bit. Now, I've had technical issues in sharing my PowerPoint before, so I do apologize that this currently is not working, but my computer is refusing to cooperate at the moment, as you may see, so I'm just going to verbally share with you my presentation, if that's all right. So following the unification of Greater Romania in 1918, several attempts were taken by the Romanian government to Romanianize and assimilate the Roma into society. However, by the 1930s, ethnic Romanians, uncomfortable with the encroachment of the Roma into what they deemed to be Romanian territory and space, began petitioning for their removal from the Romanian public sphere. By 1938, the Gypsy question, consisting of a wide-ranging debate on whether the Roma should be assimilated or removed from society, came to the forefront of political discourse. Eugenicists dominated the debate, declaring Roma, and I quote, the greatest racial threat to Romania, end quote, advocating in some cases for their complete removal from society. So this presentation outlines the means with which the Romanian government utilized discriminatory discourse to marginalize the Roma from mainstream society during the interwar period. I argue that the inability of the ethnic group to adapt to economic changes caused by industrialization and the state's desire to modernize, coupled with their perceived unwillingness to assimilate into society and the ineffectiveness of the Romanianization policy, drove the Romanian government to implement policies of internal colonization. When looking at the social standing of the Roma in Romanian society during the interwar period, two questions arise. To what extent did preconceived and conceived prejudices and stereotypes of the Roma affect the ethnic group's social standing? Could the Roma be assimilated into society, and if not, what is to be done with them? Likewise, when considering the role of the Romanian government, two questions come to the forefront as well. Why was the Romanianization policy effective in assimilating ethnic minorities such as Germans or Ukrainians, but not effective in assimilating the Roma, in particular the nomadic Roma? And how did the Romanian government utilize and manipulate the notion of us versus them to justify the policy of internal colonialism of the ethnic group? Now, when looking at the study of the Roma in the interwar period, it is beneficial to reflect on the terminology used to describe the ethnic group. A variety of terms, including Roma, Gypsy, Romani, and Țigan, have been utilized in public discourse. Self-identifying Roma individuals notably use the term Țigan when referring to themselves or other individuals of their clan. As well, ethnic Romanians utilize the term Țigan to identify the ethnic group. In contrast, as of the early 2000s, the term Roma has come to be used in academia as the appropriate terminology. The existing terminology and its use are a reflection of the function and historical identities associated with the term. The use of one term over the other is a political act, as it reflects how the Roma clan itself sees itself and the mass public perception towards the group. Now, for the purpose of the presentation and in tune with academic scholarship on the subject matter, the term Roma will be used. I avoid using the term Gypsy, for it is derived from the false assertion that Roma originated from Egypt and not from India. Secondly, the term Gypsy is Latin with stereotypes both romantic and mythical in nature, whereas the term Roma, at least in the English-speaking world, is content neutral. The term Țigan will only be used when referencing phrases made by ethnic Romanians or the Romanian government. It is important to note as well that the use of the term Roma both in academia and public discourse has caused some backlash. As noted by Benjamin Thorne, some individuals of Romanian descent, particularly Romanian statesmen and politicians, feel undignified with the use of the term, arguing that the mass public is unaware of the origins of the ethnic group and associate Roma with ethnic Romanians. This sentiment was echoed by a fellow statesman arguing, and I quote, "This word Roma was a creation of radical agitators. Worse, when you use the word Roma, people will confuse them with us, with the Romanians. It is better to call them gypsies. This is how they have always been referred to and how they call themselves." End quote. The differentiation in terminology is considered essential in distinguishing ethnic Romanians from Roma. Now, in order to provide a complete examination of the assimilation policies targeting the ethnic group, it is essential to address as well the stereotypes associated with the Roma. Foreign travelers to Romania from Western Europe during the interwar period reflect on the mystery and fascination of the Roma. Emil Hopp, a noted photographer of German origin traveling across the Balkans, noted, "The requirements of the Țigan are primitive and elemental. He is violent and quarrelsome, though never vicious, and his actions are governed by monetary impulses rather than premeditated thought." Hopp continues noting that the Roma were, quote, "never able to adapt to any settled mode of life, choosing instead to pick up odd jobs while satisfying their wanderlust." He was then completely different from his European counterparts, end quote. The traveler's account echoes the Romanian government's very prejudice of the ethnic group as primitive, backward, dirty, and uneducated. The stereotypical conceptions stem from the group's nomadic lifestyle, which became perceived as detrimental to the social order of the modern state. Now, following the First World War, the geopolitical order of Central and Eastern Europe shifted. Developments in the interwar period were determined by the Treaty of Trianon of 1920, which led to the breakdown of the previous alliance system. The treaty recognized the Alba Iulia Proclamation of December 19, which saw the unification of territories with majority of a Romanian population. The peace treaty itself increased Romania's landmass by 158,000 kilometers and its population by over 5.2 million people. This included a Romanian majority of over 3 million, a German minority of over 500,000, and a Hungarian minority of over 1.6 million, composing 1/3 of the entire population of Transylvania. However, following unification, Romania faced several challenges in incorporating minorities into the new polity. The unified state recognized that fostering a wave of Romanian nationalism was key for institutional and legal homogenization, recruitment of national elites, and most prevalent of all, the nurturing of a national consciousness amongst the educated and non-educated strata of society. Now, in order to assimilate the provinces with a substantial minority population, the Romanian government initiated educational and cultural policies that resulted in the national mobilization of the state. The Romanianization policy aimed to assimilate ethnic minorities into the Romanian nation through the spread and implementation of Romanian ideals, culture, and education. One method in which Romanian officials sought to spread these ideals was through the implementation of educational policies, noted above. Full-fledged nationalism projects with the target of assimilating the ethnic minorities, including Roma, were constructed. In an attempt to establish Romanian institutions of learning throughout the state, the Romanian government granted incentives to Romanian teachers willing to move to the periphery of the state or any areas, urban or rural, where ethnic minorities generally conglomerated. Romanian teachers were first and foremost responsible for teaching Romanian to ethnic minorities. This was partly because most minorities living near the border did not speak the language. In the case of the Roma, education needed to be first introduced and then institutionalized. Unlike other minorities, such as the Hungarians or Jews, who already had their own established institutional forms of education, Roma education was generally conducted at home, in the private sector rather than the public. As such, education became one of the main tools of assimilation. In the eyes of the Romanian government, this was not a policy of aggression, but rather one of peaceful assimilation. Ethnicity remained an intrinsic aspect of nation building, and language became the key criterion. However, linguistic and cultural assimilation did not have the desired effect on the Roma population. While relations between ethnic Romanians and Roma remained civil, interaction between the two groups remained limited. In the 1930 census, Roma population accounted for over 200,000, or 1.5% of the total population. However, some historians have argued that the number might not be accurate, as it is not a viable representation of the total Roma population residing in Romania. The total ethnic population at the time could account for more than 500,000, but due to prejudice associated with identifying as a Roma or Romani, the number is lower than expected. As such, the interwar period was dominated as well by economic turmoil and modernization. As a result of the Romanianization policy, Roma were subjected to certain economic restrictions. In the wave of industrialization, the Romanian government progressed to modernize society and civilize the population by replicating and implementing the modernization trends that swept across Western Europe decades earlier. Competition for industrialization caused certain professions to decline. For example, Roma working as tinsmiths, musicians, and craftsmen suffered competition from foreign enterprises. As well, Roma working as bear tamers, the ursari, were prohibited from practicing their occupation following the banning of wild animals as household pets. With the coming of industrialization and modernization, many of the handcrafts made by Roma fell out of favor with Romanian peasants, who could arguably purchase cheaper and superior quality factory-made products. As such, Roma, forced to abandon their traditional trades, either took up marginal occupations such as street sweepers or engaged in the practice of peddling, two occupations that pushed them into the lower strata of society. When discussing the space Roma inhabited during the interwar period, it is important to note that their position in agricultural economy was marginal. Historians note that this was not in the cultural interest of the Roma to become agriculturalists, since their nomadic ways and skills in trade took precedent. Land ownership was limited as tillage was not the preferred means of occupation. This was primarily reserved for the Romanian peasants. With the socio-economic conditions of the interwar period, Roma leased land from the peasants on the periphery of villages, and in exchange provided them with services and goods. However, despite economic exchanges and social collaboration, social differences between Roma and ethnic Romanians persisted nonetheless. As a result, the Roma remained, and I quote, the poorest social category within the villages, as they constituted a labor force that was extremely cheap and available at all times, end quote. As a result of their social and economic inferiority, Roma formed a separate class, one that was marginalized to the periphery. As one peasant expressed, I quote again, the Romanians do not mix with the gypsies, except in trade. The gypsy remains a gypsy, end quote. For the Roma clans specialized in tent dwellings, their nomadic lifestyle persisted during the interwar period. Although there were not many clans of tent dwellers, their incessant movements was seasonal and unprecedented. The nomadic nature of the group became of concern for the Romanian government, who found it difficult to exercise control over them, as they were not integrated into either rural or urban communities. As such, the government perceived them as relics, unwilling and unable to adapt to a modern society. Unlike the Roma clans who did not assimilate into Romanian society but resided on the periphery of the villages, tent dwellers remained distant and separated from Romanian culture. In contrast, however, Roma residing in urban centers, were culturally integrated but spatially isolated. Roma working as goldsmiths, aurari, or fortune tellers, the ghicitori, engaged with the Romanian public on a regular basis. However, their place of residence remained separate, as they lived in residences known as mahala. For the Roma clans living in these ghettos, if we were to employ a modern-day term, the mahala was a space where regulation and restrictions of society were lifted. However, for ethnic Romanians, these spaces were perceived as dirty and a permanent source of illness. The very existence of these spaces, close in proximity to the spaces ethnic Romanians inhabited, as well as the continued interaction between Roma and ethnic Romanians, fueled discriminatory discourse. As one mother living in Cluj notes, I quote, Our children's upbringing is endangered because they have daily contact with the Roma, and our children will contact their pernicious habits, end quote. The sentiment was not singular in thought, as a growing number of ethnic Romanians, including a variety of social and religious groups, supported the rising political narrative of the interwar period. According to Liviu Stan, an Orthodox theologian, racial interbreeding was becoming a prevalent problem within Romanian society that needed to be addressed. In his publication, Racism Regarding the Gypsies, Stan takes a critical stance stressing the need to protect ethnic Romanians from the enemy. He concludes that biologically, the Gypsies have altered the Romanian people. The Gypsies have polluted us. By using the notion of us versus them, Stan painted the Roma not only as outsiders, but as the enemy of the state. In doing so, he conceptualizes the ethnic group as a racial menace, one whose influence has led to the deterioration of the Romanian spirit, and by the extension, the Romanian nation, or poporul român. Now, in an attempt to impose a physical barrier restricting interaction between nomadic Roma and ethnic Romanians, the Romanian government conceded to gather the group into designated areas as a means of vanquishing their nomadic ways. Population control was perceived as the primary method in which the Roma could be entreated to settle inland or on the periphery of villages or cities, that they no longer travel as vagabonds to dishonor the Romanian name as pariah throughout society. Seizing nomadism was considered the first step in bringing civilization and generating the lifestyle of the ethnic group. If the Romanian government could restrict their movement and their ability to interact with the outside world, they would no longer pose a threat to the modernizing project. In the eyes of the government, sedentarization would also be beneficial for gathering a concise estimate of the total Roma population residing in Greater Romania. The means to enforce sedentarization was through this policy of internal colonialism. The Romanian government rationalized internal colonization as a civilizing mission, seeking to bring modernity and social order to the Roma way of life. As Benjamin Thorne argues, the mission, publicized as an allocation of the ethnic group that would ultimately strengthen and unite Roma communities across Romania, saw the creation of zones of residence or designated parcels of land. These zones of allocation were considered the solution to preventing further intermixing between ethnic Romanians and Roma. While the creation of these zones ultimately resulted in the infringement of Romani rights, as it stripped the ethnic group of their agency, in the eyes of the Romanian government, the civilizing mission was a means of establishing control and social order. So to conclude, industrialization policies and the principles brought from the West and Romania's desire to modernize, coupled with the ineffectiveness of the Romanianization policy and the Roma's perceived unwillingness to assimilate into society, drove the Romanian government to implement policies of marginalization, which further segregated the ethnic group from society. However, the relationship between the Romanian government and ethnic minorities residing in the newly formed states cannot be perceived as uniform or entirely conflict-dominated. There are exceptions to the case that depend on the various clans. However, overall, the Romanian government sought the creation of a nation-state not where citizens were equal under the law, but one that ethnic Romanians could call their own. This was the key of the nation-building project of the interwar period. With the construct of the nation in mind, the demarcation of who is Romanian, and most importantly, who is not, came to the forefront of political discourse. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cristina, for that really thoughtful paper. I enjoyed listening to it. This wouldn't be a Keller chaired panel if I hadn't either mispronounced somebody's name or overlooked an introduction, Cristina. So I do want to say quite quickly that Cristina is a PhD candidate at Western University. She did her master's degree in European and Russian affairs at the University of Toronto. And as we've just learned, her work examines the driving forces of anti-Ziganism, anti-Gypsyism, and anti-Tiganism in Romania, and the means to which they violently manifested in the state, from unification of the principalities of Wallachia and Moldova in 1859 to the end of the Second World War. I want to thank all three panelists for such fascinating papers and for the opportunity to chair this panel. I learned a great deal from reading them. They were exciting, and they reminded me that I actually do enjoy doing history after being under this pandemic and kind of questioning everything. So thank you, all three of you, for that. We have a number of unifying themes here as we look at the consequences of the peace following the First World War. And we see that the violence that had been on the battlefield transfers itself to violence in these reshaped or newly formed states. And what we see is that the shadows of this war offer opportunities for various groups within these states to define what it means to be a nation. And it seems that the idea of a modern state in some ways contradicts or seems to clash with the notions of nationhood until it's somehow ameliorated by these policies we see in these three papers. We find then in Central Europe and in Eastern Europe that these ideas of Wilsonian self-determination ring hollow now in these multinational states following the collapse of these multinational empires in Central and Eastern Europe. When I was thinking about Peter's paper and chemical weapons and reminding myself that Germany had been at the forefront of the chemical industry during the so-called Second Revolution, where these chemical advancements defined what it meant to be modern or for progress at the time, I was thinking about these weapons and how Germans framed them in such racialized terms, or at least right-wing Germans did. And I'm just wondering how uniquely German was that? Was this a particular German way of thinking about these kinds of weapons? This may be stretching ourselves a little bit as we think about how universal these weapons became to a degree during the war. And I was also wondering, during the interwar period, were there voices that made themselves heard against these chemical weapons or against framing the weapons as such in such nationalistic terms? If we think about it, troubled soldiers and civilians, in what way that it did so, where for those on the right, it became a way of defining. I really enjoyed learning about this Polish Constitution of 1921 and all the ways the various parties use language to cloak their intentions of further marginalizing what might have been already marginalized groups. We see this then, this violence of state building that comes out of this. I was wondering if there were, once this Constitution was somehow ratified, were there any subsequent legal challenges to this document we know of? And I'm just wondering if the debates that played out during this ratification process, do they come up in later elections? Do we hear echoes of this then throughout the 1920s and into the 1930s? So we have here definitions through weapons, definitions through constitutions, and then thirdly, we find definitions through educational and cultural policies there in Romania dealing with Roma. I'm wondering if these policies that we find there in the 1920s and the 1930s, was this anything new for nomadic Roma? Had they encountered such prejudice before? Was it just now that is being codified into educational or cultural practices? And then this made me also wonder, what were the plight of the Roma during the First World War, as we think about these consequences of the peace? I was curious about the situation of the Roma during armed conflict. So those are my first just kind of brief thoughts for us to get the ball rolling for our discussion. Those in the audience, feel free to chime in as well. You can post your questions in the Q&A or in the chat, and I will be happy to read them out for us. Thank you. And feel free, panelists, to take those questions or ignore them. We can proceed now and see if any questions come up in the chat. Peter, maybe you'd like to start for us.
Sure, I can start while we wait for anything potential. So the first question of how German were the weapons and therefore the vision surrounding the weapons in the interwar period. And to that, I do think they are rather German specific, and not just the ones I'm talking about, but I don't really see this language coming up among the British, the French, or the Americans, the other major producers of chemical weapons, but of course there are others. And I think that goes back to the sense of precariousness that the Germans experience in the interwar period, which maybe is all an illusion to a certain extent. But the Treaty of Versailles and the the destruction or the dismantling of the German army, the claim that they're no longer allowed to produce airplanes or chemical weapons. It's precisely this sense of precariousness among ultra German nationalists that then allow them to start thinking about what do these weapons mean for us. Certainly during the war, there's all kinds of, thoughts about what chemical weapons mean, but they're not really couched as much in national terms. Certainly the Germans are very proud of their chemical weapons at the start, but it then becomes a chemical weapons race in which everyone is producing them. And then it's individual reactions to, if you're a soldier on the front, how miserable it is versus someone who believes that they're tactically useful. And then to the question about counter voices, there are plenty. There are pacifists who distinctly consider themselves anti-gas activists in Germany and in other nations, and they have somewhat of a transnational network. And I want to make it very clear that my conceptual history is only one strain of thought about chemical weapons. There are many others that go in various strange directions. But this one obviously creates some kind of link between, we could even say, imperial pasts and, the Nazi gas chambers, which I also want to be very careful about because I'm only talking about it conceptually. I don't want to make large connections about, material or actual, distinct historical moments that lead us from one space to the next. But I do think there's this rhetorical and conceptual connection. And the one last thing that I want to add to these many counter voices or debates that swirl in the interwar period is that while there is a lot of questioning about these kind of right-wing claims about chemical weapons, there is very little questioning about the racialized language surrounding them. So even pacifists will say, well, we don't want Africans to have chemical weapons, so we need to stop producing chemical weapons, etc.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Meghann.
Yeah, now I want to know if the Poles were concerned about German chemical weapons. It seems like it would have been such a natural preoccupation of theirs, as they were especially the right-wing Poles, were constantly concerned that at any moment Germany was going to come back and, invade. Why would they fear this thing? But going back to your questions, Tait. So in terms of the legal challenges to the Polish constitution, there was a coup d'etat in Poland in 1926. Most of the structure of the constitution stayed in place well up until the mid-1930s. The part that the coup d'etat concerned itself the most with had to do with the presidency and the executive office. In fact, there tended to be, on both the left and the right, a fair degree of recognition that certain types of social hygiene projects were actually salubrious for a new modern state. And so you do definitely see both publicly and then behind closed doors, leftists and right-wingers coming together to think through problems such as temperance or prostitution or things of these natures that almost everyone has some kind of agreement were not good for Polish society. And were industries that in the national imagination had been on some level tied to Judaism. And so there is this way in which, in terms of social policies, you can get the left and the right to agree. A lot of the anger came around, who was actually going to run state, and that's where really bitter feuds would happen. I think that there is this notion, particularly amongst certain types of Polish scholars, that the left wing wasn't at all sort of racist, because in contrast to the right, they seem more palatable, but they tended to actually have a Polonocentric view of things. And you can usually still tease out ideas that would structurally lead one to believe that, their concepts of who the ideal Pole was tended to also be in alignment with the understandings that the right had. Nevertheless, when we start talking about later elections ceased to be completely free in 1926, though they roughly do continue in some guise moving forward after the coup d'etat, which the coup d'etat comes from the left, not the right. However, the first presidential election in 1922 of Gabriel Narutovic, he is assassinated. And he is assassinated by a right-wing activist with the understanding that his mandate was not legitimate because the people who voted for him were not overwhelmingly ethnic Poles. They were Ukrainians and Jews and Polish leftists. And so the 1920s is an absolute bloodbath in terms of political assassinations, as the interwar period in Poland tries very hard to negotiate the sort of power struggle and how Poland should be moving forward in order for it to be a viable nation state, where they really thought that they were beset on all sides by enemies that were seeking to destroy them. And they weren't entirely wrong. Both the Soviet Union and the German Foreign Office were not happy with the way Poland had been constructed at the end of World War I. So they were insecure and had lots to be insecure about.
Thanks.
So thank you very much. Thank you very much for your questions, Tate. I apologize for cutting you off. To answer your first question in regards to the education policies, if these were new or codified, I would make the argument that they are new. And I think we have to make that argument primarily because we have to devote a portion of the analysis to the public and the private sector. What I mean by this is that Roma education conducted in the interwar period, even prior to that, was done primarily in the private sector. That is at home, in the household. And of course, it is very much also arguably a gendered form of education, because the women were conducted and instructed in how to be domestic wives, look after domesticity and take care of the children, etc., and the land, while the males were informed of how to take to their trade and to be active members in their society and their trades. But in the interwar period, you see this movement and this turn from the Romanian government to bring education from the private to the public. And this has to be, of course, the secondary layer of institutionalization of this Romanian education. So not so much Roma education, but Romanian institutionalized education conducted through various spheres such as schools. As for your second question in regards to the plight of the Roma during the First World War, I think it's important to mention as well here and to discuss the empires and the breakdown of empires and the multinational population in these empires. Because Romania here was located where three multi-conglomerated, multi-ethnic empires come. That's the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and the Russian Empire. So for the Roma residing in Transylvania, which was under the Austrian-Hungarian Empire up to 1919, you had policies of anti-Ziganism that were implemented by Mother Teresa prior to that, targeting the Roma, seizing to end their nomadicism and for them to sedentarize. For the Roma established in the unified principalities of Romania, that is the Wallachia and Moldova, you have a different set of policies prior to the First World War. Not so much heavily targeted towards the ethnic group, because in context of the larger nation building project, the policies didn't directly target them, but were looking more at the national level. Now, for the United Principalities of Wallachia and Moldova, there are records that showcase of Roma men fighting in battle, that being active soldiers on the front lines up to that point. So I will end there.
Really interesting, really interesting. Thanks so much. I think we've reached the end of our time together, but I was just looking quickly if there were any other questions from the audience. I'm not seeing any. So I will end us here at this point. thank you, all of you, for such fascinating papers. Thanks to those out there in the audience for attending. It's nice to know that we weren't just talking to ourselves, but there are folks out there. Enjoy the rest of the conference, everyone. I hope at some point, someday, we get to cheers each other in person. Have a great rest of your day, everyone. Take care.
Yeah, thank you, Tait.